Hi, and welcome to this short video lecture covering hormonal responses in exercise. This particular video will focus on those hormones you're typically going to see involved in anaerobic responses, a little bit of catabolic responses, but very specific to resistance training. So just a quick overview of the endocrine system. The endocrine system is composed of chemical communicators. So typically our endocrine responses take a little bit longer to take effect and they're longer lasting, depending on the kind of hormone you're dealing with. Again, it takes a little bit longer, so a slower response, longer lasting than, say, a neurotransmitter like a catecholamine. We're typically going to see some regulation and control using a feedback mechanism, most commonly a negative feedback mechanism, similar that you'd see if your house's thermostat. That's typically what's going to regulate our hormonal responses. And we'll see that these hormones are going to travel from their site of release to their site of target. They're going to act then on the target tissues, either using a cellular membrane receptor, or they'll actually go through the membrane and target and attach to the cellular nucleus. Hormones are going to help us monitor the internal environment. They are really fantastic because they integrate physiological systems at rest and during exercise. And again, very much like your house's thermostat, it allows us to maintain homeostasis using a checks and balances system. Typically using negative feedback. There are a few different systems that use positive feedback as well, but different receptors in your body and sensors in your body will help regulate, again, that homeostatic response. Hormones in general can regulate anything from electrolyte balance, fluid balance, red blood cell production, substrate metabolism, anabolic responses like muscular growth, catabolic responses like inflammation and cell breakdown, and this particular lecture is going to focus on more of those anabolic and catabolic responses, but some other things that you might see are in terms of exercise would be the regulation of glucose in terms of aerobic exercise over time, as well as the electrolyte water balance that would probably be more typically involved in a longer duration aerobic program where you're going to tend to see more changes and fluctuations in plasma volume and sweat production. So again, key highlights, unlike the nervous system, we're going to see endocrine system using chemical communicators, typically taking a little bit longer periods of time. It's going to help us monitor our internal environment and regulate homeostasis. Typically takes longer to take effect, but those effects are longer lasting, and it can help us regulate during rest and exercise. So the two different main types of hormones are going to be steroid-derived hormones using cholesterol as the backbone and amino acid-based hormones. Steroid hormones are probably least common, so we're going to have more amino acid-derived hormones in our body than steroid. I've highlighted here a few different sites of the steroid hormone release. So like our adrenal glands, we'll see cortisol, our ovaries, our testes, we'll see estrogen and testosterone, to name a couple. Anything that's derived from cholesterol would be those lipid-derived hormones. This is going to be a very rigid structure, and we're going to see that the steroid hormones are lipid-soluble. So what does that mean? Lipid solubility means that they're hydrophobic, meaning they don't play well with water. They're not going to be absorbed in water, and they're lipophilic. That means they easily pass through fat. So if you think of your cell having a phospholipid bilayer, that means our steroid-derived hormones can easily pass through that bilayer, and they're going to then bind at the cellular receptors, which means it takes them a little bit longer to initiate any sort of change. So generally speaking, if you're talking about a steroid-derived hormone, the effects of that take longer to present than a peptide or amino acid-derived hormone. The actions of our steroid hormones, like I mentioned here, you can see it's traveling through the cell membrane. It's binding to the cellular receptors. Pretty much all steroid hormones, the receptors are found inside the cell, within the cytoplasm or the nucleus. It's going to bind to the DNA and transcribe gene activation. So we're going to see mRNA synthesis and protein synthesis in response to where this particular hormone is going to bind. Our non-steroid-derived hormones, this is going to be your amino acid or your peptide-derived hormones. These are not lipid-soluble, which means they cannot cross the cell membrane. This means that they're hydrophilic and lipophobic. The receptors for these are on the cell membrane, and these are associated with secondary messengers. So you're going to see a target receptor at the cell membrane, then a series of secondary messengers that will go into the cell to exert whatever kind of hormonal response change you're looking for. These are generally going to be faster in terms of their actions compared to a steroid-derived hormone. And some common secondary messengers you might see would be cyclic AMP, cyclic GMP. Another couple would be IP3 and DAG, just in case that might come up on a study exam question. And they're going to be, again, very, very quick in relative to steroid-based hormones. An example of this would be insulin. So insulin is going to bind on the cell membrane. It's going to then transcribe secondary messengers that will send a glucose channel, GLUT4, to the cellular membrane to allow glucose to pass through. So that is one example of this peptide or amino acid derived hormone. Okay, so now let's take a look at a couple of these different hormone types. So we've covered what generally hormones do, the different types of action, whether it's a cell membrane binder or an internal cell binder, depending on if it's amino acid or steroid derived. Now, there's a few different types of hormones that you're going to see most commonly discussed in terms of resistance training. These would be your anabolic hormones and then your catabolic hormone cortisol. So one of the first anabolic hormones is going to be coming from your hypothalamus and your anterior pituitary. Your pituitary has an anterior and a posterior portion. The anterior specifically is where you're going to see growth hormone being released. We have releasing factors coming from your hypothalamus to then your anterior pituitary. Once those are triggered, growth hormone will be released into your bloodstream and target its target sites. A couple of those target sites are listed here. So muscle, liver, and bone are some of the target sites for growth hormone. So we'll see growth across all three of those different areas and systems. And typically we see a higher intensity of exercise, a higher load of exercise. We'll see a greater response in terms of growth hormone release. Here is that sequence of events. So we have growth hormone releasing hormone. That's going to go to the anterior pituitary to release growth hormone itself. It's an anabolic hormone targeting tissues and organs, again, specifically muscle, liver, and bone. And it's going to be general growth, so muscular hypertrophy. We also see that growth hormone is going to release substrate. So both glucose and fat tend to be released with growth hormone, which means that it's going to provide fuel for these anabolic responses. Acutely, that's great. Chronically, that's not so good. So you don't want to have extremely elevated growth hormone for an extended period of time, or even like a tumor on your anterior pituitary, because that would lead to some substrate imbalances, maybe type 2 diabetes, over-enlargements of the heart, which is why steroids are bad, because you don't want to have that negative response. But acutely around exercise, these things are good, and they're going to support anabolic muscle growth, bone growth, all those sorts of good things. We also know that it's proportional to exercise intensity. So as I mentioned earlier, a higher intensity, a higher volume is going to lead to a higher or greater release of growth hormone. Some of the other anabolic hormones release sites. So we talked about the hypothalamus related to growth hormone. We also have the Leydig cells associated with the testes, and that would be testosterone. And we have the liver, which is associated with the release of insulin-like growth factor. All three of these are going to support muscle protein synthesis, growth, and gains, basically any anabolic or building response. In women, women tend to have lower levels of testosterone, so the anabolic hormone in women is going to be estrogen. Estrogen is going to, or estradiol is coming from the ovaries, and those estrogen peaks are going to typically stimulate the greatest periods of muscle protein synthesis in that particular group. We also have the catabolic hormone cortisol, so it's a steroid-derived hormone. It's going to stimulate the release of substrate, particularly amino acids from muscles, glucose from the liver, and free fatty acids from the adipose tissue. Again, acutely very good. It's going to provide that fuel to help support anabolism. Chronically is bad. So we'll tend to see elevated cortisol levels with overtraining syndrome, with chronic inflammation. We do not want to have elevated catabolic hormone for a long period of time because that's counterproductive to muscle growth and hypertrophy. So short term, it's great. It's going to help fuel that inflammatory response that we need for muscle growth for that anabolic compensatory effect. But long term, we really don't want to see it. Stresses and physical stress, so fight or flight response, tend to have greater influence on cortisol. If you have a decline in blood glucose, meaning needing more substrate, cortisol is going to mobilize substrate, so that will create that signal cascade to try to mobilize more of that fuel in your body to support recovery from that inflammatory catabolic event that you may be experiencing. Here we see cortisol in a little bit more detail. Generally, testosterone, growth hormone, and cortisol are the big three that you're going to see being tested on, especially for the CSCS. So important to know the sites of release for these as well as their general functions and how they relate to each other. Again, in general, none of these things are inherently bad. It's just we see them having negative effects if they are dysregulated or if they remain too high for a too long period of time. So again, here are the release sites for cortisol. We're seeing that come from our adrenal cortex, and typically in response to an acute stressor, but long-term stress, long-term inflammation can also lead to elevated cortisol. So how do you maximize these anabolic responses? Well, there's a couple really key facts when you're planning your programming. One is very heavy loads. So a very high percent of your 1RM, typically what you're going to see with a hypertrophy or a strength paradigm on like your 4x4 matrix, that's going to be the best trigger for that anabolic response. Also very high volume. So if you increase the total volume, that also tends to increase the anabolic hormonal response. And what that means is more release. So anabolic hormonal response means the greater release of those hormones. Increased time under tension. So even if you're working at a smaller percent load, but you maintain that load for a longer period of time, this would be like 30% 1RM to failure kind of situations, that will also lead to an increased anabolic response. And then shorter rest periods. So generally, if you decrease the rest period, you decrease the time for recovery, you're going to increase that acute inflammation, which is going to help stimulate this anabolic response, as well as that acute increase in cortisol, which in that acute period will help support muscle protein gains, and also some bone gains depending on what kind of fuel or structure you're looking at. I hope you found this video helpful. This should give a nice kind of crash course and guide of what you should focus on for your CSCS studying. But again, make sure to go back and read your chapter and your outcomes to get the finer point details of these hormones as well as others that may be involved in glucose metabolism and aerobic training that you might see on your exam.